Welcome back, everyone. Tonight is the last session of the series on the history of anti-Semitism. I got the recording going good. And thank you for all of you for keeping with us, as we've gone through this series. Maybe at the end, I want to take some moments to look at the broader picture and what we learned from the different chapters of what we looked at over the discussion of the origins and the history of anti-Semitism over what was really a 3,500 year span that we looked at over the course of this series. The last evening tonight is on anti-Semitism in the United States. And what I do want to look at, and I'm going to share with you some elements of this to go through the ADL's the ADL publishes each year, it's called an Audit of Anti-Semitic Incidents. They keep track of, and we'll look at the definitions of what counts as an anti-Semitic incident and track the difference. And they've been keeping this every year since 1979. And there's what gives us a sense of what anti-Semitism in America looks like. I'm going to put that on the screen so we can look at that together. Just give me a second for that. And here we go. Okay. Okay. So this is the document that came out. It came out recently within the last month, their 2021 audit. And I'm going to show you a few things. Most important is that they showed an increase in incidents. They tabulated over 2,700 incidents, and it's in fact the largest amount that they've shown since they started counting these. I'll show you in the graphs. It'll be easier to look at here. This is over a 10-year period from 2012 to 2021. And you can see, first of all, a tremendous increase from 2020 to 2021, up to 22,717 incidents. But we also see a significant uptake from 2016 to 2017. So the questions that we're going to come back to and look at over this evening in the time that we have is that there was definitely an increase in anti-Semitic incidents happening in the United States over the past 5 years. And there are different theories to why that is. One can certainly point to the fact that the 2016 presidential election might have been a trigger in validating extreme nationalisms. And that wasn't just an election in this country, it was a wave, across the world. And one could see a similar uptake in incidents that are recorded in Europe as well. But we'll also see there are other factors as well. And there's never one simple solution for everything. The Trump presidency is complicated because on the one hand, it did, in a sense, give a green light to right-wing extremism that had an anti-Semitic element to it. On the other hand, President Trump's daughter and son-in-law were very outwardly identifying Jews. So Jews were sort of closer to the center of power than ever before as well. So that just those two elements next to each other, I bring that up just to make the point that you never have there's never a simple black and white explanation for why things happen. And part of the challenge for historians is to be able to tell the story in a way that makes sense. But just looking at the data here, you see that there was, things were sort of hovering around a certain number in 2012, 2013, 14, 15, then 16, it gets a little higher, a significant jump in 2017, a little drop from 2019 to 2020, which is probably due to COVID with not as much happening in the world in general. And then we have a significant jump from 2021, and 2022 is still is still happening. The way they understand incidents, they falls into three different categories. One is harassment, which here's the definitions: cases where one or more Jewish people or people who are perceived to be Jewish were harassed verbally or in writing with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, slurs, or stereotypes. And so that's one type. The second type is vandalism, which is defined as cases where property was damaged in a manner that incorporated evidence of anti-Semitic intent or which had an anti-Semitic impact on Jews. Swastikas, which are generally interpreted by Jews to be symbols of anti-Semitic hatred, were present in 578 of the 853 incidents of vandalism. So any swastika that's drawn on the wall of a synagogue or in a school, and if they understand the context to be impacting on Jews, and it's complicated because sometimes a swastika could have another context, then that's what most of the vandalism cases are. And the third is assault, which is defined as cases where Jewish people or people perceived to be Jewish were targeted with physical violence accompanied by evidence of anti-Semitic animus. And there was an increase in assault as well. So harassment is basically verbal or in writing. Vandalism is damage to property, and assault is damage or attempted damage to one's person. So, and they'll look at those. So those are the three different categories. And you can see here in this graph, looking at 2019 and 2020, and then the increase in 2021. The blue category is harassment, the dark blue is vandalism, and assault smaller. So there were 88 cases of assault that ADL was able to document in calendar year 2021. This is all in the 50 states and the District of Columbia. And they had cases in all 50 states and the District of Columbia between overall in incidents of anti-Semitism. And here it shows the variety by different states. And what we see is that the states that have the largest amount of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic incidents, it doesn't follow a political map. It follows the map of where, the way I understand is where population is and where Jews live. So the state that's hit the hardest is New York with 416 cases of anti-Semitism. And then you have California with 367. And most of those cases were in Los Angeles. Most of the New York cases are in New York City. So New York City and Los Angeles are the two most populous Jewish areas. And what's disturbing about that fact, about that data, seeing where the incidents are, is that it tells us that it's not that a Jew is in danger when you go to a place where there are no Jews. You see, if you go to the middle of the country, there are far fewer incidents. There's one recorded incident in North Dakota in 2021. But if you go to places where there are a lot of Jews, like New York City or Los Angeles, then you see a significant increase. So what it shows us is that anti-Semitism is, in a sense, its reaction against where Jews are is going to attract the incidence of anti-Semitism. Would be more cases per capita would be more revealing. Yes, that would be one way to look at it, Eric. That's true. But this is how they recorded it. Now, here it breaks it down by month. And it looks at the difference between 3 years, 2019, 20, and 2021. So the first thing, and they explain this through the report, is that there is a dramatic increase in incidents of anti-Semitism in April, May, in June over there in 2021. And what they find is that correlates to events going on in Israel, with Israel and Hamas were in action, where there was hostilities, there was over the Gaza border, that it was matched that as Israel was engaged with Hamas, you had a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. So it correlates. There's no other way to explain this huge jump at that period basically in the second quarter of 2021. But even if we discount that, as this is a blip caused by events in Israel, triggered by people's anger at Israel because of Israel's engagement with Hamas in Gaza, even if you discount that, you can still see the overall increase in numbers from 2021 vis-a-vis 2020 and 2019. And this actually breaks it down there. So, they're pointing out that the incidents by day, so the incidents more than doubled during the May 2021 conflict between Israel and Hamas and its immediate aftermath. So the yellow is the 2021 compared to the 2020 numbers that can be matched there. And the dates are May 10th was when fighting broke out between Israel and Hamas, and the ceasefire occurred on May 21st. And it took till about May 27th until the increase in incidents dropped. So, it's interesting. And that goes a lot to what we were saying last week. That's the challenge that Israel brings to Jewish identity, that the hope of Zionism, when I had talked about in the last class, Theodore Herzl's intent in the foundation of political Zionism was to find a solution to anti-Semitism, where not only does Israel a place where Jews could go to escape hostility and persecution, but that also pride in Israel and identification with Israel would normalize Jewish identity throughout the diaspora as well, and the Jews would not be seen as a foreign people with no country. What we've seen, though, is that Israel has, while in many ways, and not to discount the good that Israel does, but there is a liability in that when Israel is engaged in actions that at least part of the world disapproves of, there is that anger is taken out against the Jewish communities in the diaspora. And again, similar graphs could be shown with how Jews in Europe fared also during the period of the Hamas conflict. And that correlation there is, we're going to look at that in terms of how anti-Semitic incidents are defined, because we talked a bit about that last class also, that when can one disagree with a policy of Israel, and when does criticism Israel become anti-Semitic? And the basic response to that, and we'll see the ADL's definition and how they understand it, because they need a standard in which to in order to quantify the data here, excuse me, is that if it's one thing to criticize an Israeli policy, but it's another thing to criticize the Jewish people in general, and to with a specific policy of the state of Israel, even if it's engaged with hostility. We'll see how that carries through, because they'll show us some examples. This is, there are a few photos. These are all from 2021. This is from September in a New York City subway station. 9/11, Israel did it. And Israel is often misspelled, but that was discovered in September, blaming the Jews for September 11 terrorist attacks. Okay, now this is outside of a synagogue in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where there have been ongoing protests by a group that demonstrates throughout the year outside the synagogue. You can see the sign, America First, Not Israel. The organization is called Witness for Peace, and they are deemed by the ADL to be an anti-Semitic as well as an anti-Israel group. And one of the reasons why they define that is because by demonstrating outside of a synagogue, and the synagogue is not an Israeli consulate, right? So by demonstrating against Israel outside the synagogue, it takes the anger out on American Jews who are entering the synagogue to practice their religion, and the ADL is understanding that as an act of anti-Semitism. Find some of the other Israel. The other examples is Israel no right to exist, and other signs are found there. And they had done a study of the trauma that the members of that congregation have been going throughout the year, as being faced as they're faced with these protesters outside. That's the front. See, this is from the front of the synagogue, so they can't walk onto the property of the synagogue, but they're permitted to have these protests right outside the synagogue. Assaults in 2021 were terrible, not like the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue, or in New Jersey in the market and other places where there was loss of life, but nevertheless, it seems as if, and you can just read through the list here, I'll make it a little bigger, the type of assaults that were tracked across 2021. Overall 90, yeah, okay. Now, wait a second, I want to go back to this. This is, why is it considered anti-Semitic? So let's go back to this picture here, right? Why is it submitted anti-Semitic to protest against Israel at a synagogue, right? So you might say, and if the police is not arresting them, right, the argument is, well, it's freedom of speech, and one has the right to freedom of speech, right? And when it's verbal, that's or when it's written, that's harassment. So, and then it's only when it becomes vandalism or assault that then the police are able to get more involved. So if you look at their definition here, it says it is anti-Semitic to target Jewish people and Jewish institutions engaged in religious observances for harassment because of their real or assumed support for Israel, and hold them responsible for the policies of Israel's government, right? Because that synagogue in Ann Arbor was being targeted because it was a Jewish synagogue, right? It's not targeted because of its specific actions in support of the Israeli government. And even if the assumption is real, right, that the members of the synagogue support Israel, they're not going to synagogue. Now, if it was an event at the synagogue that was a rally in support of Israel in its conflict with Hamas, then you could have protesters outside. But if you have protesters outside a synagogue when people are going for Yom Kippur services or for Shabbat services or dropping off kids for Hebrew school, the ADL argues that crosses the line, and that becomes anti-Semitic harassment, because the Jewish people as a whole are being targeted for people's anger about Israel. And that's where it crosses lines, what I had written about, what I call the China test, right? That we can criticize policies of the Chinese government, but if we take that anger out on Chinese people in America, right? If we boycott, protest outside Chinese restaurants because we're angry about China's policies with the Uyghur minority, then that becomes anti-Chinese people, right? And not just a protest against the Chinese government. It's a distinction that not everybody accepts, but that's what the ADL is arguing here, and I think there's a lot to that. Now, okay, these are just shows you the increase here in. I'm just looking to check. Killing of the well-known Arab Israel. I don't know, Linda. That's a good question. Whether the killing of the Arab journalist who was killed in the West Bank had inspired anti-Semitic incident. It probably did, and someone left a. All right, we'll have to look. Stacy, we'll have to look at that. You'll have to remind me. I'll take a look at that comment. That's interesting. I hadn't seen that. Even our own talks here trigger responses there. Linda, I don't have the answer specifically. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. We might only find out later because there's often a lag of reporting time where if an incident is reported to the police, then first of all, the police need to, by their standards, define it as a hate crime. That definition is usually by the prosecutors. And then they have to report it. And there's a hate crime reporting that the FBI contains a database of it, but it's voluntary. And one of the things that the ADL, one of the arguments that they make in this report is that the amount of reporting to the FBI's database from police investigations across the country has dropped significantly, and that reporting up the line is not happening. The ADL has a way to fill out an incident report. You can report something directly to the ADL, but the actual numbers of anti-Semitic incidents are certainly significantly higher than what they're able to document, number one. And number two, until the reporting happens, usually police need to investigate and then a prosecutor makes a determination. So until something is known, unless it was significant enough that it hit the news, we wouldn't hear about it until later. But when the ADL publishes the 2022 report, which will come out a year from now, we'll be able to look back and see if they saw an uptick because of that. Does the ADL keep records, Razani? I'm getting a chat on university campuses. Yes, absolutely. They keep records of all. We'll see the different types of incidents that they look at. Okay, so they're tracking here specifically extremist activity. And this is a few specific organizations that they're looking at here. The Folkish Resistance Movement, the Goyim Defense League, which is a play on the Jewish Defense League, very local to us, the New Jersey European Heritage Association, and an organization called White Lives Matter. And all of those they're specifically tracking. And here, this is a sign outside of a Jewish institution in Florida that was found in November. It says the Goyim know and 88. And the number 88 apparently is a white supremacist code for Heil Hitler, because H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. So 88 means HH, which stands for Heil Hitler. This is a sign that's put up in front of a major Jewish institution in Florida. Okay, if you're interested about the New Jersey European Heritage Association, it distributes explicitly white supremacist propaganda, often focused on white victimization or targeting various groups, including Jews, Blacks, immigrants, LGBTQ community. And they also, a lot of these groups work with each other. This was a sign, where was this? This is in New Jersey. This is put up by the New Jersey European Heritage Association. I don't know where this was found in October, but it says voting will not drain the swamp with a Jewish star drawn underneath it. So the idea that they need to do more than voting, and that and the implication is that hostile action is necessary. Looking at schools here, and you can see that, again, these are the three types of anti-Semitic incidents: harassment, vandalism, and assault. The large number, right, is in 2019, 184 cases of harassment, 220 issues of vandalism. Those are basically swastikas found in schools, and 7 cases of actual assault. It's very low in 2020, goes up in 2021. So why is it so low in 2020, school incidents? Because of COVID, right? Because schools were closed. So schools were closed. And even with the year that schools were closed, you still had a significant amount, right? You still had 68 cases of vandalism and 93 cases of harassment that was found. And then the numbers go up in 2021. There is still It's not all schools are fully open. I would not be surprised. I would expect the 2022 number to be even higher and to get back to where 2019 was, if not even exceed that. And again, the drop here is a function of school closings because of the pandemic. This is a playground in New York, right? Where you see a swastika drawn on the playground there. And also they talk about, they make a point that the numbers are much higher in schools than they know about, given the insidious nature of bullying, compounded by the fact that many children may not feel empowered to report their experience. It is likely that the actual number of anti-Semitic incidents taking place in school was significantly higher than the data reported in the audit. There's no question about that in my mind. I mean, there are swastikas that are found in our schools, in our area, in northern New Jersey all the time. And they're not all reported and they don't all get into this audit. I know that as a fact, for a fact. Okay. Now, someone had asked about campus incidents. They trace the campus incidents as well. So you see there have 155 anti-Semitic incidents at colleges and universities occurring at over 100 campuses across the country, a 21% increase from 2020. Here's one example. Well, here's the graph. So you can see these are specifically college university campuses. Again, the drop in 2020 is also because of the pandemic. So there were fewer people on campuses, and then it goes up in 2021. And again, I expect the 2022 number, unfortunately, to be even higher. Thankfully, just as in K-12 schools, the numbers of assaults are very low, right? So at least our children and our college children or younger children, it's not a physical danger, but that swastikas are found and anti-Semitic graffiti and harassment against students goes on a tremendous amount on campus. This is in Colorado. It's just a university sign, and then there's a swastika there drawn, you see, before university in Colorado. And now this is they're talking about Jewish institutions. So this is a synagogue in Spokane, Washington, a swastika drawn outside the front of the synagogue. And this is the synagogue's Holocaust memorial. A number of, very common for synagogues to have a memorial garden outside. At Temple Israel, our Holocaust memorial is inside our main lobby, but this is on the outside, and it was vandalized. And you can see it's vandalized by the same spray paint with which the swastika was drawn on the front of the synagogue, which is evident there. One second, let me just, okay. So here, this is the numbers. They broke down all the different categories. So this is increases on Jewish institutions. What you see here, unlike K-12 schools and colleges and universities, here there's no 2020 dip, right, from the pandemic, that there's a very clear gradual increase every year in incidents of anti-Semitism. And most of them are the harassment. I mean, we've received harassing voicemails where there'll be, where a Marine will come into the office in the morning, and then there's a voicemail waiting on the synagogue machine that's someone ranting and raving about the Jews and about Israel. And we were concerned, and we reported it to the police, and they found out who the person was. We got a picture of him that we kept in the office should he come by. He's not local, but sometimes, if someone gets a hold of a number of a synagogue, and then you can get one synagogue can be targeted with that's with that type of harassment, which thankfully did not do us harm. But there are always concerns with mail coming into synagogue. We are very careful at the synagogue, and I mean, you should all be in your homes anyway also, but especially at the synagogue, we'd never open a package unless we were expecting it and we recognize who it came from, because you never know what's inside the box when you open it up. And unfortunately, these are the things that we have to worry about now. This is a hiking trail in New York State, right? Look at this photograph, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And there you can see through the graph, the swastika that was etched into the bottom of the trail that's on a hiking trail that was found in February of 2021. These are the different types of where the incidents were found. So it's the smallest category, but unfortunately, we still see desecration of Jewish gravestones, business establishments. The largest is the general public area, then Jewish institutions, schools, that in synagogues are included there, public schools, non-Jewish schools there, and others. So those are the different types of categories. This is the 11 cases of cemetery vandalism. The fact that this happens in our country, it's even though it's a small number relative to swastikas drawn on synagogues, it's still extraordinary that this happens. I spend time in Europe where we know that there were Jewish cemeteries were destroyed by the Nazis, by the Hitler Youth. And then we see this happening in our country. This was found in April of 2021 in California. You can see that there. Okay. This is all the data there. I want to show that just from the methodology, I want to read this last paragraph here together. ADL is careful not to conflate general criticism of Israel or anti-Israel activism with anti-Semitism. However, Israel-related harassment of identifiable groups or individuals may be included when the harassment incorporated anti-Jewish references, accusations, and or conspiracy theories, or when American Jews are demonized for their real or perceived support of Israel. ADL also includes cases of picketing of Jewish religious or cultural institutions for their support for Israel. So that's their approach, that they're not counting all anti-Israel protests. Right, certainly people have the right to protest policies of the Israeli government, as they do have the right to protest any government or any policies or anything, because we believe in the freedom of speech. But it's different when the criticism is directed at synagogues or at Jews, and that's when it crosses the line into anti-Semitism, and that just articulates the methodological approach there that they're taking. Okay. So that's what I wanted to show you from the, I'll just show you one more thing about reporting that you can see there. It says, the FBI's most recent release of the annual Hate Crime Statistics Act data for 2020 revealed a continuing trend of increasing hate crimes being reported in the United States under the federal government's voluntary reporting regime, even as fewer law enforcement agencies provided data to the FBI. So the amount of law enforcement agencies reporting these hate crimes up the ladder to the FBI database has decreased. And nevertheless, the absolute numbers has increased in the numbers of reports are being reported, even though there's fewer reporting agencies. And the implication there is that the numbers are probably significantly higher than what the ADL has been able to track. So very disturbing when this came out. There's one more. I want to share one more thing there to look at before I close that. When this was released a few weeks ago, and I just want to get to the section where they talk about extremism, specifically white supremacist extremism. Deborah Lipstadt, who is the author of a book that I quoted from before, Anti-Semitism Here and Now. She has a book, History on Trial, My Day in Court with David Irving. She's a Holocaust historian from Emory, and David Irving is a famous Holocaust denier. She was finally approved, confirmed by the Senate for the Biden administration's envoy representative on anti-Semitism. And this was a position that's been around for a while. Her confirmation took a long time because there were some concerns from the Republican caucus that she was focused on anti-Semitism from the right and not on anti-Semitism in the left. Now, I read this book very carefully, and she is very, very clear in Anti-Semitism Here and Now, and this book is published in 2019, that the dangers from the left and the right, and she's very, very careful, but she also successfully apparently successfully convinced those senators who were concerned that she committed herself to looking at anti-Semitism on both sides of the political spectrum, and ended up being confirmed in a bipartisan confirmation vote. So that that being said, there has been a lot of talk about white supremacy and the danger of that because of the incidents that happened only 2 weeks ago in Buffalo, specifically in Buffalo, and we were put under alert because the assailant in Buffalo had published a manifesto that was specifically was filled with anti-Semitism and also anti-Black hatred, and listed New Jersey, as New Jersey was mentioned. So because New Jersey was mentioned, I was at a briefing last week with the police department, the county prosecutor's office, and they put all synagogues and Black churches on security alert for last weekend with extra patrols as a precaution. Not that there was a credible threat for our area, but nevertheless, because of that just hit the news. And we had the county SWAT team came by the synagogue on Friday night during our big meal there that we had. Most of us were enjoying chicken and salmon that Joe prepared, and others, and we had our own security officer, but the county force came by because they had asked us to let them know if we had having any special events at the synagogues or churches, and I did let them know. And they've made a point of specifically coming by Temple Israel. And again, so that has to do with the concern from extremism. And I just want to show you what the ADL writes here. And again, this was written before the events of the last couple of weeks, right? It says the domestic terrorism threat, which is overwhelmingly from right-wing extremists, and in particular white supremacists at this time, right? That is the overwhelming threat, and it's a cause of significant concern. All right, I dropped the share so I can see everyone. I want to read you a few passages, and the passage will go into sort of why we're seeing this uptick in anti-Semitism and kind of where we go from there. I want to read you a few passages from Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. It's a disturbing book, but a really beautiful book to read. She's a wonderful writer. This came out just last September. And Dara Horn, local, she lives in Montclair, I think. And the other reason why I want to highlight her, and I mentioned her before, is that we have secured her as our speaker for our Holocaust Memorial Service next April, in April of 2023. It is quite a significant speaker, and that's the interfaith service that we do combined, and we're going to hold that at Westside Presbyterian Church, which should be very moving, because one of her chapters here is a long chapter. It talks about Barry and Fry and his work in rescuing Jews out of Germany during the Shoah. So I want to read you the passage here, what she writes from one chapter and then something at the end. This is her third chapter. It's a short chapter. It's titled Dead American Jews, Part 1. There are no words. This was what I heard most frequently from good people stunned by the news one Saturday morning in October of 2018. 11 people murdered at a Pittsburgh synagogue, the largest massacre of Jews in American history. But there are words for this, entire books full of words. The books the murdered people were reading at the hour of their deaths. News reports describe these victims as praying, but Jewish prayer is not primarily personal or spontaneous. It is communal reading, public recitations of ancient words, scripts compiled centuries ago and nearly identical in every synagogue in the world. A lot of those words are about exactly this. When I told my children what had happened, they didn't ask why. They knew, because some people hate Jews, they said. How did these American children know that? They shrugged. It's like the Passover story, they told me, and the Hanukkah story, and the Purim story, and the Babylonians, and the Romans. My children are descendants of Holocaust survivors, but they didn't need to go that far forward in history. The words were already there. The people murdered in Pittsburgh were mostly old, because the old are the pillars of Jewish life, full of days and memories. They are the ones who come to synagogue first, the ones who know the words by heart. The oldest victim at the Tree of Life Synagogue was Rose Mallinger, age 97. The year Mallinger was born was the tail end of the mass migration of over 1 million Eastern European Jews to America. Many brought with them memories of pogroms, of men invading synagogues with weapons, of blood on holy books. This wasn't shocking because it was already described in those books. On Yom Kippur in synagogue, these Jews read the stories of rabbis murdered by the Romans, including Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion, who was wrapped in a Torah scroll set aflame. Before dying, he told his students, "The parchment is burning, but the letters are flying free." My synagogue's old High Holiday prayer book, a classic edition edited by Rabbi Morris Silverman that dominated 20th century American synagogues, hints at what these stories meant to American Jews of Ms. Mallinger's age. Its 1939 English preface asks, who can forget, even after decades, the sight of his father huddled in the great prayer shawl and trying in vain to conceal the tears which flowed down his cheeks during the recital of this poem. By the time, I don't know, Eric, I don't think so. By the time I was a kid reciting those poetic stories, no one was crying. Instead, my siblings and I smirked at the excessive, gory details, the violence unfamiliar enough to be absurd. But Rabbi Hanina must have been right, because we were still reading from that same scroll, the same words Jews first taught the world: do not oppress the stranger, love your neighbor as yourself. People Ms. Mallinger's age were in their 20s when word spread about mass murders of Jews in Europe. In synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, they read the old words begging God for compassion, for the sake of those killed for your holy name, and for the sake of those slaughtered for your uniqueness. My husband's grandparents came here after those massacres, their previous spouses and children slaughtered like the people in the prayer. They kept reciting the prayer, and for their new American family, it reverted to metaphor. In the decades that followed, Jews from other places joined American synagogues, many bringing memories that American Jews had forgotten. Those memories were waiting for them in the synagogue's books. On the holiday of Purim, they recited the book of Esther, about an ancient Persian leader's failed attempt at a Jewish genocide. It's a time for costumes and levity, for shaking noisemakers to blot out the evildoer's name. One year, my brother dressed as the Ayatollah, and the Persians in our congregation laughed. Another year, someone dressed as Gorbachev. The Russians loved it. The evildoer seemed defeated. In 2000, when Ms. Mallinger was 79, a Jewish senator was his party's nominee for vice president. A year later, the White House hosted its first official Hanukkah party. About a decade later, I attended one myself, Sarah Horn writes. In the White House, we recited ancient words, thanking God for rescuing us from hatred. To older Jews, this felt miraculous. My parents and grandfather gawked at my photos, awestruck. But at the party, I met younger Jewish leaders who often attended these events. To them, this was normal. The ancient hatred was a memory, words on a page. Or maybe it wasn't. In 2001, after terrorists attacked American cities, concrete barriers sprouted in front of my family's synagogue. Police cruisers parked in the lot. This felt practical in a nation on edge. We assumed it affected everyone. As my children were born and grew, the barriers and guards became their normal. When I took my children to an interfaith Thanksgiving service at a church down the street from our synagogue, one of them asked me why no one was guarding the door. In the years that followed, the internet suddenly allowed anyone to say whatever they wanted, rewarding the most outrageous from every political stripe. Soon, comment sections became an open sewer flowing with centuries-old garbage. And as social media exploded, those comments evolved into open vitriol as abstract hate scaled up to direct verbal attacks on Jewish institutions and individuals. To young Jews, this felt confusing. To old Jews, it must have felt familiar. a memory passed down and echoed in the holy books. When Ms. Mallinger was 97, she and 10 other Jews were murdered in their synagogue. There are words for this too, a Hebrew phrase for 2,500 years worth of people murdered for being Jews, Kiddush Hashem, death and sanctification of God's name. My children were right. This story is old with far too many words, yet they were wrong about one thing. In the old stories, those outside the community rarely helped or cared. Our ancestors' consolation came only from one another and from God. But in this horrific new reality, perhaps our old words might mean something new. When they return to synagogue, mourners are greeted with more ancient words. May God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. In that verse, the word used for God is hamakom, literally the place. May the place comfort you. May the people in this place comfort you. The first responders who rush to your rescue, the neighbors who overwhelm evil with kindness, the Americans of every background who inspire more optimism than Jewish history allows. May this country comfort you with its infinite promise. As George Washington vowed in his 1790 letter to a Rhode Island synagogue, America shall be a place where everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Those words aren't his, they're from the Hebrew prophet Micah on the shelves of every synagogue in the world. In synagogue, as always, we read from the scroll we call the tree of life, and the place will comfort us. As we put the book away, we repeat the words from Lamentations, renew our days as of old. In those extraordinary 5 short pages, she lyrically summarized the American Jewish experience of anti-Semitism from George Washington up to the attack on the Pittsburgh synagogue. And she does give us a sense of optimism, right? That neighbors do care. I remember the morning after the massacre in Pittsburgh that the local Pittsburgh paper printed on the front page in Hebrew letters, Yikadal v'Yikadash, the opening words of the Kaddish. And that was an extraordinary sense of the community and the sense that I believe in many, and certainly my sense from my non-Jewish friends, my interfaith colleagues in Ridgewood, that when there are attacks against Jews and other minorities, there are attacks against everyone, and understood that way. I also hope that section would excite you about hearing Dara Horn in person next year, as I'm excited to hear her. I want to just read one final paragraph. This is from the conclusion. And she's talking about why is there this uptick in anti-Semitism that we just saw in the ADL report. And again, I want to stress, it's the highest incidence of anti-Semitism the ADL has reported since they started to keep these records in 1979. So Dara Horn writes, of all the tedious and self-serving explanations for why this scourge in anti-Semitism is apparently reemerging in American life, and she gives some of the theories. Some is guns, that the availability of guns. One is Trump, talked about that, trolls and Twitter, right? And she mentioned that elsewhere, that it's and I said it could be the growth of the internet, right, and the accessibility of hatred, that there was an uptick in anti-Semitism after the invention of the printing press in Europe, and that there's another uptick in anti-Semitism after the spread of the internet, which is a similar point in the ease of sending out information, that is able to form virtual communities of every type of people, including people who hate other people, and that gives fuel to that. So that's an important development that's independent of the political developments that we can look at. But she gives another explanation. She says, the most convincing was actually the most boring and also the most disturbing. The last few generations of American non-Jews had been chagrined by the enormity of the Holocaust, which had been perpetrated by America's enemy, and which was grotesque enough to make anti-Semitism socially unacceptable, even shameful. Now that people who remembered the shock of those events were dying off, The public shame associated with expressing anti-Semitism was dying too. In other words, hating Jews was normal. And historically speaking, the decades in which my partners and I had grown up simply hadn't been normal. Now normal was coming back. And those are the scariest words to read. And it's what she was talking about in the chapter that I read, that her children were not as shocked by the massacre at the Pittsburgh Synagogue as she was. That maybe it was the post-Holocaust sense of disgust with anti-Semitism. And not only because it's evil, but because it was associated with the Nazis, who were the enemy whom Americans fought against, made anti-Semitism socially unacceptable. And now we have a new generation to which those who did not experience that and are not driven by disgust and shame in the Holocaust. And this is more, the reality that we're facing now is the more, she calls it normal, right? It's the reality that Jews have faced throughout most of our history. When I look back in history, and we did this when we did the session on the development of anti-Semitism in the industrial period of late 19th century, it always strikes me how you can have political parties in democracies that put anti-Semitism in their platform, right? That one of the things that they were running for was that they wanted to work against the influence of the Jews. And it strikes me, how could anyone publicly admit to that type of prejudice and anti-Semitism? But perhaps, again, that reaction that I have is because of the gravity of the Holocaust, and also having grown up in the United States, which defeated Nazi Germany. The sense of that anything associated with swastikas, with Nazism, right, with genocide in that sense, is anathema. And unfortunately, that sense of reaction is dying away. I don't mean to criticize anyone specifically, but I do have the virtual bully pulpit here. So I will say that attendance at Holocaust memorial services is dramatically dropping. I'm hoping that having Dara Horn there next year will bring more of us out. And I know that we see a general decline of attendance in general because the pandemic continues to afflict so many people. But overall, attendance at these programs across the country is declining as the actual survivors of the Holocaust are gone, and our relationship to the memory, to that trauma, is more tenuous. And as that distance gets greater and greater, it becomes that much more important for us to keep, to remain vigilant for Holocaust education. The ADL calls for other states to follow the New Jersey example of having mandated Holocaust education, but also to be able to understand that Jews as a target for hatred is something that has unfortunately been a constant throughout most of history. And we followed in this course the long trajectory of it. We saw how we saw evidence of it in ancient Egypt we saw evidence of it in the stories of the Bible before Christianity, in the Greco-Roman world, prejudice against the Jews. We saw how the break off of Christianity away from Judaism was intermixed with a dialectic that saw Jews as the ones who rejected the divinity of Jesus, the salvation that Jesus brings, and how that translated into hatred and prejudice against Jews throughout so many centuries of Jewish history, Jews living in Christian Europe. We saw how the prejudice against Jews in the Muslim world, how it was not as severe as the Christian world, but was certainly there. And we saw how that exploded after the establishment of the state of Israel. We saw how most famously with Spain, but other places as well, how Jews were entirely expelled from the countries where they had lived for centuries and were never accepted as being a part of the people from which they lived. And we saw how even modern developments like the Protestant Reformation, like the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, things that are generally seen as being bringing progress to the world, how those had tremendous anti-Semitic elements to it, where Jews were seen as everything that had to be struggled against, and were stigmatized and were even physically attacked. And we saw the worst case where the Nazis turned the power of the German government as it expanded throughout Europe in the World War II to a systematic industrial genocide where so many millions were killed. And we saw subsequent to that continued hatred against Israel, directed against Jewish kids at college campuses across our country. And we've seen how anti-Semitic acts, harassment, vandalism, and actual assault, even to the point of a massacre in a synagogue, can happen right now in our country. And you only have to go to synagogue to see the changes that we've brought about, the security bowlers that we've constructed, the special glass, the fobs. And I know it's inconvenient that the doors are not open the way they were in the past, but these are the changes that we've had to make, because we've found, as we've learning these lessons over the last several years, that America is not exceptional and needs to live under the same concerns and the same vigilance as our fellow Jews in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And yet, there was always room for optimism, as Dara Horn pointed out, the sense of friendship across the aisle. So last weekend, Al and I were in Oberammergau for the famous Passion play that's every 10 years, and was once a great example of anti-Semitism. Hitler attended it twice, told everyone to go and see it, because the Jews were depicted as as paradigmatic devils who only wanted not just to kill Jesus, but have him tortured. And the story is told now, and I was with a group that was coordinated by Rabbi Marins. Many of you know him from AJC. He used to be at Temple Israel. We were also working with Rabbi David Sandmel, who's does interreligious relations with the ADL, and two other scholars. And myself were working over the last, basically the last 3.5 years with the production, to work with them to help them take out, the director, take out the anti-Semitic elements of the show. And while there's still work to be done and the story is still problematic, our sense is, and my sense, having seen the premiere last Saturday, that one does not walk out being filled with hatred for Jews and wanting to take that out on Jews the way that Hitler thought people would when they saw it in the 30s. The play lasts a long time. It was almost midnight. We were walking back to our hotel, and Alice says we're walking in this small German village. Alice says it's safe here. And I said, yeah, as long as it's not, I looked at my watch, as long as it's not between 1933 and 1945, it's safe here. But not only that, and it wasn't just a blip, that it's a lot safer than it was in the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s as well. There's a book by an American Reform rabbi who went to see the Passion Play in 1900, and then he published a series of sermons about it. And it was before the Nazis came to power, and he didn't feel personally endangered, but he certainly didn't have the experience that I had here. And I want to show you one picture just to relay that. Just give me a second to find that here. Let's see. And of course, right when I need it to work, my computer is slow. Wow. It's not connecting there. So give me one more second as it's circling. I can't access it. For some reason, it's the connection to the email server is not working now. Where I had the picture, but it was a picture of me and the director. You can see that we're very friendly. And the point is that we have relationships, we formed relationships and outside the Jewish world, individually, a lot of us individually, and also the Jewish people as a whole worldwide. And those relationships convinces me I have to believe that it's not the same story over and over again, and that we are in a position of greater support and appreciation than we have in other periods of history, and that these elements of anti-Semitism, these incidents are disturbing, are scary, and they need to be watched, they need to be called out, and they need to be fought against, and we need to do what we can to make our people, our institutions as safe as possible. And while there may have been a sense of false security for a certain time, we're in a period of correction now, but in the long scheme of things, over a 3,000-year period, we are still living in this century. We are at a time that is special, and I do believe we are blessed to experience life as Jews now at this time. So again, we covered so much. I want to thank everyone for your attention. It's 9:05, but I'm happy that we can stay for a bit more. Any comments? And I see Tova and then David. Tova, go ahead. How are you feeling, by the way? You got to unmute. I'm hoping you said I'm feeling good.
Well, I'm getting there. I'm getting
okay.
There. Still, thank you. Still a way to go. So one of the things that struck me was your comment about the fact that so many young people today, didn't know or don't know survivors.
Right.
And it's such a different time in so many ways, from when many of us were young. I mean, the other thing young people don't know about is a time when Israel didn't exist or when it was a new country.
Right.
And those are, it really strikes me. And I was also, I have noticed myself that at our Holocaust events, memorials, there are many less people. I mean, I remember even my mom's gone 3 years, and even when she was alive, it was packed when we did it at the West Side Church. I mean, it was just, always packed there.
Right.
And it's something that it saddens me and it worries me, especially when we look at, in light of what's going on here in America, let alone around the world. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, the numbers, and it's the numbers have dropped because the connection is decreased. Right.
Yeah.
It's the Holocaust is an event in history, as opposed to something that happened to people I know, or something that happened to someone I know to someone that person knows. Right. We were, I think all of us were at least by 1 degree were directly related, by 1 or 2 degrees. But in the younger generation, it's 3 degrees or more. And that's a very, very significant change. David, I think that's David Weiss with a hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Hello, we can hear you. Yes. So,
in reading, the various newspapers and other media, I'm struggling that on college campuses, the social justice warriors are, out in force against Israel and anybody who favors Israel. And UN has disproportionately ruled against Israel when, so many other countries do worse things. So I'm just wondering, when you talk about, the preponderance of anti-Semitic acts, committed by people on the right, like, are these acts that I'm just referring to, do they make it into the ADL report?
The 80, I mean, they cover everything within that fits the definitions of what, of what it means. So there are on campus, the anti-Semitic acts on campus are going to be primarily from the left, right? But there's very, very little acts of assault. It's mostly acts of harassment. It's an incredible amount of harassment of college students. And most of it is from the left. I think in the overall numbers in the country, there's more incident, more of the aggressors are from right-wing extremist groups and from the left, but you also have from both sides, and that's what Deborah Lipstadt said. She said and I said she's clear about it. She says that the danger is from both ends, and I felt does a very good job in laying that argument out in her book. But in her book, I mean, when this one, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, is focused on discourse on college campuses, because that's where she is a college professor. So that's what she's most familiar with. I'm talking about how, the BDS movement, the boycott against Israeli scholars, and not just that, but against just students who are Jewish being, and the prejudice that they exposed, perceived, real or perceived, using ADL's terms, in terms of the relationship for Israel. So I would agree. They say overall, the problem is from the left in the college campus. In the greater sense, it's from both sides. We have no paucity of people that don't like Jews, unfortunately. Bob Dworkin, then Eric Weiss.
Okay, yes, thank you. Young children don't know to hate. They have to be taught to hate. And who teaches them? Their parents, other relatives, friends, and what I call unsocial media. Is there something that could be done, in your estimation, to reach out to younger children who we recognize as being taught injustice and hatred, to get them to question the validity of what they're being taught?
That's the great opportunity that we have with education, right? So that's why it's so important that New Jersey has a mandatory Holocaust education, but there's a lot more, right? We have all children who go to public school they're sitting in classrooms that the state can mandate curricula for. And now, again, it's going to be different, done different ways in different districts, but that's part of the reason why there is public education, right? It's the education of future citizens. Well, they are citizens, of future voters, right? So there's an incredible opportunity there to teach. We can't control what parents say to their children in their home, but we can control what children are taught in school. Control's the wrong word, education. We can have an influence, right, in what's presented to children in school. So I think that's where there's such an extraordinary opportunity, and it's why it's so important to always be investing in education. And when we see that education budgets continue to be cut, right, and then we wonder where people, how people can become who they are. Maybe if we put more energy and more passion and more money in the educational system as a whole, especially starting with the primary grades, as you suggested, because that's our opportunity to reach people there, and to teach them the things. So, you can't come out as a Holocaust denier and a sense of what our country should look like that people might have gotten from their parents, but they'll get something very different in school if they have the right teachers. Now, yeah, you don't always have the right teachers. In this report, the ADL cited one case where a teacher was teaching the Holocaust in a mandatory Holocaust education program and suggested to his class that perhaps the Jews deserved to be murdered, right? So you're always going to get examples like that, but overall, right, usually, and we there's an opportunity for public engagement with education. And that's one side. The other way to combat anti-Semitism is with, again, with commitment from the security apparatus, from law enforcement. So law enforcement needs to be educated and better educated on how to identify anti-Semitism. I'm not dismissing it as mere vandalism, as just graffiti, right? And to treat it for what it is, which is, one of the things that Deborah Lipstadt argued in her first public address as the government's envoy on anti-Semitism, and I thank Joe Rosen for sending me, there was just the report about that. She said, people don't take anti-Semitism, in general, people don't take anti-Semitism seriously enough until it's too late. And that's across the board. Eric, I saw you had your hand up. And then
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you also for an excellent lecture series. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate or enjoy. Thank you for doing this. It's really been educational. So I want to just tell a very short story about Pittsburgh. I grew up there. I knew people at Tree of Life. I know people at Tree of Life. That particular weekend, I know past president is a friend of mine through the men's organization. That particular weekend, there was a once every 2 years Shabbat retreat, a men's club Shabbat retreat. They don't happen every 2 weeks. Once every 2 years, there were a whole bunch of men from that congregation in West Virginia. They were ordinarily they would have been in that synagogue, and their wives didn't go to shul that morning either because they weren't there. So everybody who, we all in the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs, we scratch our heads and say there was a beshert aspect of the tragedy could have been worse, much worse. Second, the way that community came together, regardless of race, of political affiliation, Pittsburgh just the Steelers coach who lives in that neighborhood, made a big deal. It rebounded and there was great support. So that to me is the difference here. The state there's tremendous support for Jews or tremendous opposition to anti-Semitism. That gives me
and that's what Dara Horn was talking about also, and that's what I was saying. That is a positive change, and it's when we face these terrible incidents, right? It's natural to be overcome with the sense of despair, but it's important to understand that there have been very positive changes, and that's one of them. Thank you for bringing that up. Linda, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to voice the opinion of whether people are getting desensitized the way they did with all the killings in Vietnam, or the figures coming in, that they don't want to take this subject seriously or deal with it, have become apathetic, some of them. And there are some that, as you mentioned, that are very supportive, but there are others that seem to be turned off and don't want to deal with it. And so I think that's an important consideration too.
Absolutely, and the saddest element, and this is something that Deborah Lipstadt talks about, which talks about the impact of how the anti-Israel discourse has become so anti-Semitic, and the toll that it's taken, especially on students, Jewish students, that they are the hatred that they're exposed to, and that what Samson says is this. It's just part, the sense of this is just to be expected because you're Jewish, right? And that you just have to deal with those hatreds. And that is so sad, right? And that's not something that we should ever be desensitized to, right? And rather it has to always be
a heavy burden for them to carry.
A heavy burden that is unfortunately faced by our youngest people. I mean, our college students, that they face that every day in a much more in their face than we do. I mean, for those of you who weren't on the last class, when I picked up my son Lawrence from Wesleyan, which it was the week after, about half a week after Yom HaShoah, I was picking him up. We were in the center of the campus by the cafeteria. He said, "That's for Yom HaShoah." And I thought it was going to be something in memoriam for the victims of the Holocaust, but it was the opposite. It was a vicious anti-Israel placard that again, I would say crosses the line to anti-Semitism, because it made a line. It said, committers of genocide, with hints of Nazism. It was the connection that was being made. Ar Yom HaShoah of all times. So yeah, and then it's why it's that much, because this has continued to grow and he goes to the same school that I went to, and it wasn't like this when I was there, and there's been a dramatic increase in anti-Israel expression, and also anti-Semitism in general. It's not related to Israel, which we were focusing on today. But there's also those changes, those relationship changes that Eric brought up.
I think the internet plays a big part in all this.
The internet plays an extraordinary part. Yes, it does. Yeah.
Rabbi,
So I did.
Can I just
Yes, go ahead, Gloria.
My grandchildren, most of them said that the Holocaust, the study of it is so quick, okay, that they really don't feel that they really get it until I know the 8th grade classes in some of the schools like Ramsey takes them to DC. And when she said when they went to the Holocaust Museum and she saw the children's shoes and other things about the children, and she said that's when a lot of her classmates really got it. Okay,
Yeah,
but
and
not
it's
every
so
school does that.
right. And also think about the U.S. Holocaust Museum. It's so important that that institution is there. And it was and this is where we've seen the change, right? That institution was built because it was important for American Jews and their friends in the 1970s and 1980s. I don't think today there would be the same groundswell that this was what needs to be built, and a part of the grand educational project that the national capital needs to offer. Alan, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes, I had my hand up. First of all, I want to thank you very much for a great series, very educational and masterfully done, going through all the centuries that unfortunately this problem has existed. As a political scientist, I just wanted to say that one of the things that struck me about your lectures going through all the ages was what I always focus on because of my field, and that is power. And one of the strands that I picked up from all of your lectures was that a lot of anti-Semitism has to do with power. That is to say, if you're an elite or powerful or a ruler, anti-Semitism was often used to deflect from your errors or from your problems or from your own doubts about your own power or your own system. And it was used to deflect. And so the Jews were a convenient pawn there. And then if you're powerless, as so many people have been through the ages, they have to look for a reason as to how come they are living in misery. And again, the Jews were a very convenient excuse. And so blame it on the Jews. So whether you're powerful or whether you're powerless, the Jews were a very convenient excuse to try to address your own doubts, your own problems, and to deflect from your own life. And I think that resonated throughout all the lectures and all the ages that you went through. And I was just struck by that. It was one of the important points that I think you made throughout the eras that you covered in your lectures.
Thank you. Yeah, even though I would say that the Jewish power was far more often perceived than real. It's a reflection of the powerlessness of the majority, right? And their and then the role that the Jews played because the Jews were always there as the other. So all of the insecurities were projected onto the Jews, and the anger was projected onto the Jews. So I will add with just that positive image, I was able to find that picture. As I said, as disturbing as this is, the relationships that are being built today, and the friendships that we have, gives us a sense that even with all the backward steps, that there is a gradual moving forward and a betterment. It's the picture from Oberammergau, this town that this was the most anti-Semitic presentation, where all of the stereotypes were put into the presentation of the Jews. And this is a picture of me with the director of the Passion Play now, just from a week ago there. And you can see that he was so, media all over the place. The premiere, this is in a show that's being seen by 500,000 people go to see this production from all over the world. And his chief concern was, did he do right by the Jews? Did he succeed in taking the anti-Semitic elements, the most offensive and others, out of the show, out of the play, and how important it was and how important to him that his friendship was with me and his other Jewish friends. So it's images like that are the images that I want to end with, rather than those other pictures that we looked at from the Ada Rappel report and others. Unfortunately, the history of anti-Semitism is not over, but our class is. And I want to thank you all for joining me over this course.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Excellent.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
No visual, huh?
Rabbi, the only thing that was on my mind was just that I wanted to mention about tomorrow.